I studied archaeology quite briefly. I mean, for about a year, actually, before I decided to commit myself completely to being an artist. The influence of archaeology, I mean, has been very large, but it's mainly been to spread my interest beyond the contemporary field and even beyond the Western art. I'm interested in all art. You know, if I think about it carefully, I mean, I would imagine that I started really quite early to contextualize my work because I didn't go to art school. I started as an artist surrounded by other artists 20 or 30 years older than I was. Basically, I was involved in happenings and in performances. And the earliest ones were very much to do with sexuality and the beautiful combination of sexuality and revolution. And I very quickly decided that that was not what I wanted to do. I started experimenting with materials, really experimenting with materials in sort of 1960. A lot of these materials that one worked with, not just myself, but lots of other artists who've worked with new materials 20 years ago or 50 years ago, those new materials are no longer in production, and you can't get hold of them anymore. And it's the same thing with technology as well. I began creating manuals or writing manuals for my work when I started making works that were very difficult to put together, and I had to actually take them apart in order to store them. So the work itself didn't remain complete, in other words. I would finish it, set it up, show it, and then take the whole thing to pieces, and it would be in a crate. So it needed a manual. Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, they were pieces that were stacked pieces. They were very precise mathematical works and had to be stacked in a particular way. So I had to write at least notes. It wasn't exactly a manual, it was notes for myself, actually, because I wouldn't remember a few years later how it went together. And then when I made The Woman of War and The Lady of the Wild Things, I had to write a real proper manual because it was so complex to put together that I didn't think, well, I knew that I would not be able to do it again once it came apart. I've also written quite detailed instructions for liquid reflections and for a number of my other works, and I started doing that actually in the 60s. Technical material redundancy is something that, I mean, if you ask me how I feel theoretically about it, it's quite a complex question because it involves, in a sense, you're asking me how I feel about change. And I am very open to change. All my work is about being open to change. I discover new ways of making things anyway. So, for example, I cut the Poe machines that I make now, I do laser cut the metal instead of applying on the metal a surface like vinyl or like letraset. I cut the letters into the material and let light shine through it. So, you know, they're just very different ways, and I think, in a way, you don't really want to remake your old works, you know. Exhibiting is a statement. And in a way, that's why artists who don't exhibit, even though they know everything about the art world, they might know a great deal about what's going on, they don't connect themselves with that. Because in a way, you have to exhibit and be in a market in order to connect yourself with that world. But I've written quite extensively about the way I use materials and the different materials I've used. And my idea was to have a website that was basically almost like an archive, a kind of study, so that, actually it's incredibly helpful for me, because if I want to find something in my work, I look on my website. Unfortunately, it's not complete. That's a huge work in itself. But I do think that that's a very, very good tool for other people to come in and look at the work. And then if they're really interested, of course they get in touch with me and come and see it. I have collaborated with other artists, but they're always short-term collaborations. They're not ongoing. I now have an ongoing collaboration since 10 years, actually, with a scientist, with an astrophysicist who lives in California. And this is a very large solar installation that we're both incredibly excited about. And we've developed quite complex tools to make this work.
We're in the rainbow of the sun. We're in two rainbows, slightly offset from one. That's why we have two different sets.
Oh, I see. It's not like they're generating. It takes me back.
Back to what?
The 60s.
So the work in itself is a work with the sun, where we reflect and project huge rainbows across the countryside. And what's seen, you don't actually see the rainbows. What you see are stars that define the horizon. So in a sense, what they are multiple suns. On the whole, the importance always goes to the sculpture because of my own vision of myself as a 3- or 4-dimensional artist. So I give less importance to drawings, but in fact I have a very large body of drawings and really should give them equal importance. I would like to have all my work photographed, but for example, most of my drawings are not photographed at all. I mean, I've scanned a bit, but that it's a very long process doing this. I think basically that anything can be an artwork. Anything that seriously contributes to clarifying the vision and the thought of an artist can be considered a valuable work of art, I think, or at least contribute to that. And also, it's very hard to know when you're actually making things what's going to be valuable and what's not going to be valuable. And I don't think as an artist, when I make something, I don't think about it as being valuable at all. I'm just making something or making notes or writing. And I think it's only afterwards that it may become valuable or may not become valuable. It's a very hit and miss sort of situation, really. I've had a lot of good friends who've been very aware of the historical significance of their work. I think for me it's been really difficult to actually think about my work in that context. And I also think that that's something to do with being a woman. And I think it may be a real problem because, if you look at the history of women in art, and even in history, the contribution of women to our culture, to human culture, is considered minimal, and for sure it wasn't minimal, And a little bit of digging, or even just looking at the present time, makes you realize that women contribute a great deal on every level. But those contributions, even in my own lifetime, I see them fading away. I know of many women artists who are now more or less forgotten. Can I adapt the work to change, to technological change? Or does the work have to remain within its period, technologically speaking, or materially speaking? I think it's a very subtle question, and it really depends on the individual work and exactly what you're replacing. I'm the image of she, the dancing lady. Let's talk about Duchamp. I mean, Duchamp, much of Duchamp's work was either damaged or lost. And it was remade in different periods, sometimes even by people who were not Duchamp. And yet, it still is considered valuable. And basically, the only reason that it is considered that is because Duchamp himself said, I accept this work. I think it's even better. You know? So I think it is, of course, if somebody starts falsifying your work and you're not around to accept it or refuse it, that's a different matter. I mean, I'm really talking about the artists themselves deciding whether their work can be changed or not, restored, made better, you know. So I actually think, you know, the whole idea of holding on to the past, you know, there's a limit to it. I wouldn't destroy it, but there's a limit to, you know, how much you can actually retain, if you like, originality. Change isn't destruction. You know, you have to understand the difference. And keeping things always the same isn't creation either, you know. I mean, there needs some kind of flexibility there, you know. That's what I think.